When black attorney Julian Carter was unlawfully detained by racist cops, they underestimated him. Their actions exposed systemic racism, ended their careers, and propelled Julian to judicial power. When they appeared in his courtroom seeking redemption, his decision shocked everyone. But let's start from the beginning. The oppressive summer heat radiated off the pavement, creating shimmering waves in the air as Julian Carter, a distinguished 34-year-old black lawyer, stepped out of his sleek black sedan. The downtown park across the street bustled with families and joggers, the hum of city life creating a backdrop to Julian's quiet thoughts. His suit, a tailored navy ensemble with a crisp white shirt and subtle pinstripes, was immaculate, even under the sweltering sun. He adjusted his tie with a practiced hand, his briefcase resting at his feet, a testament to another successful pro bono meeting with a struggling client. As Julian reached into his car to retrieve his briefcase, the sharp blare of a police siren shattered the relative calm. He froze momentarily, his hand gripping the handle of the case. The sound was a familiar one in the city, but the intensity with which it pierced the air felt different, targeted. Before Julian could process the situation, a commanding voice barked out, "Hold it right there!" Turning slowly, Julian spotted the source of the voice. Officer Rick Marshall, a stocky, middle-aged white man with a buzz cut and mirrored sunglasses that reflected the sun's harsh glare. Beside him, Officer Dean Calloway, younger but equally imposing, exited the patrol car with a measured stride. Their uniforms were pressed, their expressions cold and calculating, exuding an air of unyielding authority mixed with something less professional, disdain. Julian instinctively raised his hand slightly, palms open and visible, a gesture of compliance drilled into his consciousness by years of cautionary tales. His lawyer's mind raced to assess the situation, cataloging every detail, every expression, and every move. "Is there a problem, officers?" Julian asked, his voice steady but edged with the firm confidence of a man used to defending himself in a courtroom. Marshall's lips curled into a smirk as his hand rested on his holstered gun. "We've had reports of a suspicious individual matching your description," he replied, the emphasis on your description, dripping with an unspoken implication. Julian tilted his head slightly, his dark eyes narrowing. "Suspicious for what? I just parked my car." Calloway stepped closer, his gaze flitting over Julian like a predator sizing up its prey. "We ask the questions," he snapped, the sharpness of his tone slicing through the air. "Let me see some ID." Julian sighed, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. Slowly, he reached into his inner jacket pocket, careful not to make any sudden movements, and retrieved his driver's license and bar association card. He extended them toward Marshall, who snatched them with an air of disinterest. The officer barely glanced at the credentials before muttering, "Lawyer, huh? You're a little overdressed to be up to no good, but that doesn't mean much." Julian felt a flicker of anger, but kept his expression neutral. "Is there a specific reason I'm being stopped? Or is parking my car now a crime?" Marshall's jaw tightened, and Calloway's eyes gleamed with a flicker of satisfaction, as if he'd been waiting for Julian to push back. "You people think you can talk your way out of anything," Marshall snapped. "Hands on the car now." Julian's jaw clenched. "I have done nothing wrong." That single statement seemed to ignite the tension simmering between them. Without warning, Calloway lunged forward, gripping Julian's arm with unnecessary force and spinning him toward the car. The smooth surface of the vehicle's hood pressed against Julian's chest as Calloway twisted his arm behind his back. The cold steel of the handcuffs bit into his wrists, the sharp click echoing in Julian's ears. A few neighbors peeked from behind curtains or out of open windows. Some watched with concern, while others displayed indifference, their faces already retreating into the shadows of their homes. Julian's heart pounded, not with fear, but with righteous anger. He stared at the reflection of his own face in the car window, his mind racing. This was more than an inconvenience. This was an injustice, one that cut deeply into his dignity, his humanity, and the values he had sworn to defend. And as the officers tightened their grip, Julian vowed silently that this wouldn't end here. The stark interrogation room offered no solace. its cold metal table and chair amplifying the harsh glow of fluorescent lights overhead. Julian Carter sat tall, his hands resting calmly on the table despite the tightness of the handcuffs. The air in the room felt heavy, suffocating even, as though it too conspired against him. But Julian's face betrayed nothing. His years of legal training took over, analyzing every word, every pause, every angle the officers might use to justify this blatant abuse of power. Marshall stood casually against the doorframe, arms crossed, a smirk tugging at the corners of his mouth. His mirrored aviators now hung from his uniform pocket, but the arrogance remained. "You think being a lawyer means you're above the law?" he sneered, his tone dripping with condescension. Julian met his gaze evenly, his voice measured, yet sharp. "I think being a lawyer means I understand it better than you." Marshall's smirk faltered, but before he could respond, Dean stepped forward, chuckling under his breath. "Tough guy, huh? Let's see how tough you are after a night in a cell." Julian didn't flinch. He'd faced intimidation before, but this wasn't just about him. It was about the principle, the message this encounter would send if left unchallenged. In his mind, Julian was already documenting the interaction. Marshall's mocking tone, Dean's thinly veiled threats, the systemic rot that allowed officers like them to wield unchecked power. Unbeknownst to Marshall and Dean, Julian wasn't fighting this battle alone. His wife, Danielle, was already in action. At home, the moment Julian failed to respond to her call, she had sensed something was wrong. Danielle, an accomplished journalist with a sharp instinct for injustice, wasted no time. She reached out to their close friend, Judge Claire Mitchell, whose influence within the city's judicial system was formidable. Within the hour, Danielle stormed into the precinct, her heels clicking with a purpose that turned heads. Clutched in her hand were copies of legal documents, proof of Julian's spotless record, his bar credentials, and a letter outlining the illegality of his detainment. Her expression was one of controlled fury as she approached the front desk. "I'm here for my husband, Julian Carter," Danielle said, her voice cutting through the din of the precinct like a blade. "He's been unlawfully detained, and if he isn't released immediately, you'll have a civil rights lawsuit to explain to the city council." Marshall and Dean, alerted by the commotion, exchanged uneasy glances as they stepped into the hallway. Their earlier confidence waned further when one of the desk officers handed them the phone, a tight-lipped expression on his face. "It's Judge Mitchell," he said tersely. "She's asking about Julian Carter." Marshall's face darkened, his smug demeanor crumbling under the weight of Judge Mitchell's reputation. Dean muttered something under his breath, his bravado rapidly evaporating. Minutes later, the door to the interrogation room swung open. Marshall avoided Julian's eyes as he begrudgingly uncuffed him. "You're free to go," he muttered, his tone stripped of the earlier bravado. Julian stood, his posture unshaken. He adjusted his cuffs and smoothed his tie, making a mental note of every detail for later. As he walked out into the precinct lobby, Danielle was there, her expression softening as their eyes met. She embraced him briefly before turning her steely gaze toward the officers. "This isn't over," she said, her voice low but firm. "We'll see you in court." Marshall and Dean said nothing, their silence a stark contrast to the bravado they had wielded earlier. Julian stepped into the cool night air, his dignity intact, but his resolve burning brighter than ever. This wasn't just a personal battle. It was a call to arms against a broken system. And Julian Carter, with his legal acumen and unyielding spirit, was ready to take it on. Months passed, but Julian didn't let the incident fade. He filed a formal complaint, sparking an investigation into the precinct's history of racial profiling. His work drew media attention, bolstering his reputation as a fighter for justice. His career flourished as he took on more civil rights cases, winning high-profile lawsuits that put corrupt officials on edge. His name became synonymous with integrity, his victories inspiring others to challenge systemic injustices. Meanwhile, Marshall and Dean faced internal scrutiny, though they were confident their actions wouldn't have lasting consequences, until Julian's name appeared on the shortlist for a vacant judicial position. The city buzzed with the news of his appointment as the youngest black judge in its history. During his first week on the bench, Julian reviewed pending appeals, and one case caught his eye. Officers Marshall and Dean, appealing their termination after being implicated in multiple racial discrimination cases. In the packed courtroom, Marshall and Dean sat at the defendant's table, their lawyer arguing for their reinstatement. Julian sat high on the bench, his robe crisp, his expression unreadable. "Officers Marshall and Calloway," he began, his voice steady. "I've reviewed the evidence and testimony regarding your actions, including the incident involving myself." The room fell silent. Dean shifted uncomfortably, while Marshall's face flushed with indignation. "Your behavior not only violated department policy, but also eroded public trust in law enforcement," Julian continued. "This court denies your appeal for reinstatement." Dean opened his mouth to protest, but Julian raised a hand. "You had the chance to uphold justice and instead chose to abuse your authority. Your actions have consequences." As the gavel struck, the weight of Julian's words hung in the air. Marshall and Dean left the courtroom defeated, their careers in shambles. Julian leaned back in his chair, reflecting on the full circle moment. Justice, he thought, isn't just about punishment. It's about ensuring no one else suffers the same injustice.